And we're carrying on with the theme now with computing, because we're now being joined by Mike Church, who works at Kinetic. Mike, good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Adrian.
Thank you very much for joining us. So Mike, you're a computer engineer.
Indeed.
And you work locally, and we thought we'd have a little discussion about how computing has evolved over the recent years, really. And some of the computers that you worked on early in your career were obviously a lot bigger than we're used to today. So I've got some slides, and
Indeed.
I'll put those up, and then we can talk about them.
Okay. Ooh, thank you for doing that. That's a
There we
horrible face, but there you go. Yes, so I started doing, well, software engineering. I suppose we didn't call it that in them days. We were called computer programmers or systems analysts. But nowadays we'd be known as software engineers. I started doing this in 1975. In fact, when I went to Brunel University. At Brunel, you might be surprised to hear that the computer science department was part of the maths department. It wasn't really a topic all by itself, but B, they only had 5 computers in total, just 5. And I'm able to show you pictures of what 3 of them would have looked like. So on the top left in the black and white there is a mainframe computer, as it's called, made by ICL, a British company, 1903A. It was so big it would fit inside a room about 3 times the size of my lounge, and my lounge is quite big. It had to be an air-conditioned room. It made a lot of noise. I went in there once and it was extremely noisy. That particular computer, I believe, would have cost something in the region of £350,000 back in 1970. By today's money, that's about £2.5 million. So you can see they were rare beasts because they were so expensive. In addition, on the bottom, in the slightly browny, fuzzy-looking photograph, they had what they euphemistically termed a mini computer. You see at the back there a whole bunch of what look like cabinets. They're cabinets for all the electronics inside that computer. And that is quite small because it would sit inside a room the size of my kitchen, perhaps. So mini, yes, okay. Not quite as powerful. It was called a CTL Modular 1, and I had hands-on experience of that. That was fantastic. On the right-hand side, you'll see a machine called a digital PDP-8. This was the first attempt, I would say, at something approaching a microcomputer. And you can see on the front, there's a whole load of little levers. That was the only human-machine interface you had with the machine. And indeed, you had to set those levers up and down to get the machine to work at all. Besides that, just at the top of it, you can see what's referred to as a paper tape reader. Programs were stored on paper tape, not on disk. So there were holes cut in that tape, and lo and behold, you had the program read in through the paper tape reader, and then the program would run.
So back in those days, you didn't have the mouse and the keyboard that we're all familiar with today.
Oh, absolutely not. What was a mouse? No, we didn't have a mouse. I think the nearest thing we came to, I went to a place called CERN, which we'll see some computers from in a few minutes. In fact, there you go. The nearest thing they had to a mouse in them days was what was called a tracker ball. It was like a huge, great spherical ball, and you used your hands to move it around. It's a bit like an inverse mouse. But yeah. Oh, these computers, I was lucky enough to go to CERN and work there for 6 months as part of my industrial training. I came across a computer called a CDC 7600. The room you see on the right-hand side there actually was big enough to have put a jumbo jet inside. You were only seeing a small part of it. Then the CDC computer, I have a cost for it. It was something in the order of $8 million to buy that thing, about $64 million by today's money. You can see down the bottom, can you? There's what looks like a whole stash of washing machines. Now, each of those is a disk drive, and you had to put a disk pack inside there. The disk pack stored 64 megabytes. Which is a pathetic, by today's standards, amount of storage, which is why you needed quite so many washing machines to get all the disks together. On the top left, you can see that there's a whole load of tape decks as well. Each of those machines you see lining up towards the back there as a tape drive, and that was for your long-term storage. It took a team of around about 60 to 70 people to look after that machine and service it for all the scientists working at CERN. Bottom left, you'll see a picture. It's a sketch of what became the very first actual desktop microcomputer I ever worked on. It was called a DTC microfile. You can see the floppy disk there. That was around about 10 inches square. It was an enormous thing and stored about 100,000 bytes. It was, again, by today's standards, absolutely pathetic in terms of storage. But in the day when I was there in 1978, very much a state-of-the-art machine.
Excellent. And you've also got some photos here of computers at Plessey and Quest. Were these other ones that you worked on?
So when I left university and started work at a company called Plessey, Plessey no longer exists, sadly. Yes, the one on the left is a PDP-11. That particular computer, well, you can see it's not too huge. And actually its memory was 64 kilobytes of RAM. It was very, very small memory. The biggest difficulty we had with writing programs for that particular machine was that the programs were too big to fit in memory. So there was a whole art form in trying to get what we called in them days overlaid programs. It was the precursor, I think, to what you would now call virtual memory. When I moved to a company called Quest a couple of years later, they had just purchased a VAX 11780. You can see that's actually still quite a large machine. It occupied a fairly big room again, and it was costing, I think at the time it was costing, I'm just checking my notes here, because I have to get this absolutely right. In 1980, when they bought that thing, $140,000, which was about $750,000 by today's standards. It was a huge investment for the company. Unfortunately, when you have something like, and we had about 25 programmers all sharing it, obviously it took a heck of a lot of time. You had to wait a long time before you submitted your program, before you got the results back. So what they really wanted was something to sit under your desk and be your own personal computer. And underneath that picture, there's the thing called a Microvax 2. You can see what looks like a tower PC. It's the first time I came across a computer that would be a similar size to what we would call a desktop today. Having said that, that particular machine cost $20,000. By today's standards, about $100,000.
Yeah, so about the price of a small house or a very, very large car just sitting under your desk.
If I could have bought a house then, I would have been paying something like $30,000 if you convert from pounds to dollars for a house. So yeah, a very expensive beast.
Interesting.
But very useful to have, I can tell you, because it meant each of our program, we could program on it independently and nobody had to wait for somebody else's program to finish before you could move on. It made life a lot easier, a lot quicker. Yes.
So of course it was microprocessors and silicon chips and things that made the computers smaller. You've got this picture here of a precursor to what we're used to today. So this one
amuses me endlessly. It really does, because this is, you can see the title underneath it. It was made by IBM at a time when IBM did not really make computers, or they're just beginning to. They really just made business machines. That's what the BM part stands in their name. It's a part of what became a computer eventually. It's basically a macro processor, to coin a phrase. It's a processor that does multiplications, and you can see it's enormous. You probably can't see actually thinking about it because there's no scale to set yourself by, but those valves would have been something like 4 to 6 inches tall. So you can see that it's quite a large piece of kit. The valves that are in a row along the top.
Yeah, so they're a bit like sweetie jars, aren't they? They're as big as jars. Yeah,
indeed.
Coffee jars.
1943 this was, and I find it very amusing that the man who was the president of IBM at the time, you can see the quote underneath, "I think there is a world market for maybe 5 computers." He really believed that there would not be that many computers ever made for the whole world. That I find amusing, put it mildly. But when you think that the computers looked like that at the time, you can maybe understand why he thought that.
Yes, indeed. And we've got another picture here of the Colossus, which was around about during the World War.
Well, that was
So
about much the same time, actually, as the computer you saw, or the piece of a computer you saw in the previous slide. There are two pictures of it. On the left is the machine being used during wartime at Bletchley Park. And on the right-hand side is the machine. It has now been reconstructed to look much the way it did back in 1943. And so you can actually go and visit Bletchley Park these days if you wish. It's the National Museum of Computing, and I have their front page on the website underneath it. As you see, they're very proud indeed of being able to rebuild that machine, the Colossus. The really interesting thing about the Colossus is that it was instrumental in helping to decode the Enigma machine that was used by the Germans in the Second World War to send secret messages between themselves. And a man called Alan Turing was part of the team that A, invented the computer, and B, used it to decode those messages. Alan Turing, you'll know, probably referred to most often as the father of computing. That machine, as I say, was built at the same time, in the same year as the machine in the previous slide. So you can see in Britain, we were a little bit further ahead than they were in America at the time.
Yeah, and of course, at around about that time, Malvern was also very busy developing technology, and some of that's now ended up in the computers that we use today, things like the liquid crystal displays.
Indeed, yes. There were quite a few attempts by a lot of scientists across the world to create the liquid crystal displays, the LCDs, as you rightly say, but they were most successfully made, I'm pleased to say, down in the Royal Radar Establishment in, or probably known somewhat differently as the RSRE, the Royal Signals and Radar Establishment in Malvern, and they have been put into all sorts of devices, digital watches. I can think, in fact, I don't know whether you can see, I have a camera. I can't see me, so I can't tell you what's going on.
I can. We can.
Let's have a look. Oh yes, I can see me now.
There we are. Yeah.
There you go. So now that this digital camera has on the top of it, in there, you probably can't see it very well. It's got an LCD display in there as well, and this is one of the most modern digital cameras you can buy at the moment. The fact that the LCD technology is still in use means that it is, as when it was invented and made practicable in RSRE in Malvern all those years ago, it has stood the test of time and is still very useful even today.
Yes, and of course they were developing it for radar displays at the time, and interestingly they were also having trouble interfacing with it, and so they decided to investigate touchscreens, which of course we also now see a lot today on our computers.
Indeed. In fact, on the back of this very same camera, if I was able to turn it on, which I can't, the batteries ran out, sadly, that indeed has a touch screen as well. So I can see the picture I take, I can see all the controls I need, and then I can just touch the screen. Going back to CERN, touch screens were also invented there. Did you know this? They were using these. It was a little bit different to what we have today. What they did is they had a big TV screen, much like a monitor for today's computers, and they put in front of it pieces of plastic which had pressure-sensitive receptors. So what would happen is they would draw little menu items on the screen behind and align the boxes, and a finger would press the box, and that would be a separate device, which basically made it look and feel like a touchscreen. Very primitive, but you can imagine 42 years ago when I first saw that, that was actually state-of-the-art and very exciting.
Well, when I was young, I started to learn a little bit of computing with a ZX Spectrum, and I actually brought it along here. So it does actually still work, but in order to make it work, you have to plug it into a television, so as opposed to a monitor. And it had a few little bits and bobs at the back where you could plug other things in. But it was a very good way of learning a bit of computing. And nowadays, people may be more familiar with the Raspberry Pi, so I brought one of those along as well here. And of course, we've had Steve demonstrating the use of a Raspberry Pi during the day. So what's your thought on kids getting hold of these sort of things? What can they do? What should they do if they're interested in computing?
Well, they really should try and get hold of a machine like that. They're very exciting little things. They can do quite a few things with them. There's, I've seen a couple of the the presentations this afternoon that use the Raspberry Pi, and there was some very clever things going on with that. Back at Kinetic, we use the Raspberry Pi actually to give the kids who come along for our STEM afternoons a chance to program the computer to, I think what we call it is space pirates. The idea is to try and get a ball bearing down a tube by opening a series of gates. And these gates are controlled by a program on the Raspberry Pis, and they have about, I think there's 4 of them for each station, and the children are meant to change the timing of the way the gates open to get the fastest traversal of the ball through that. So that's the kind of thing that, if they're clever, they can certainly use that to write programs that operate machinery, as well as just do the more, how should I put it, brainy type of things. That's the sort of job I do. I can't explain it more than that. I think they're fantastic things because you can have them in the home. They're very simple, very easy to use, and mum and dad can help. That's the good thing.
And what do you think with the children that are maybe watching today, after they finished school in what will probably be maybe 10 or 15 years, depending on their age, what do you think they'll be doing in a computing job that's maybe different from what you've been doing?
Oh gosh, that's a very, very good question. When I look back 45 years to the sort of thing I was doing at the time, and then compare what it is now, it's a world of difference. Certainly in my day, I've already told you, the computers were very expensive and my time was very, very cheap. It meant I was allowed to go away and to a certain extent play. Whereas nowadays, because my time costs about the same amount per week as it costs me to buy a computer, I have to do engineering in a very, very formal way. The software engineering I have to do, I have to think about things, I have to design things, I have to document things, then I can write them, I have to test them. The sorts of things we're talking about today are, for example, I do internet security. So keeping information on private networks safe. So hopefully all the information that the bank holds about you and your accounts won't escape because I've put, or helped to put, I should say, security devices in place around that. I can see that being happening more and more in the future because the internet will get more important, it will get bigger, it will get faster, it will get more dangerous, and I seriously believe that we need to have a lot more people helping to keep the world safe in that area. 10 to 15 years time, I think that will be the big thing, if it isn't already the big thing now.
I was going to say there's a lot of cybersecurity talk at the moment, but I think, yes, the future's bright for those that want to go into computing. The computer's not going to go away and it's only going to become more advanced and I suspect more complicated and require ever bigger brains. So
I think you're right.
A promising career.
I think so. What was interesting to me 30 or so years ago, there was a prediction made by certain people that computers would write their own programs. I've been waiting a further 30 years for that to happen. It hasn't happened yet. I cannot see that happening too soon in the future. I could be wrong, of course. A lot of people have been wrong. I mean, the guy from the IBM saying there's only ever going to be 5 computers, or the guy from DEC, I think, he said back in 1977, he couldn't see ever a need for anyone to have a computer in the home. And yet, I currently have something like 12 computers just in the downstairs room I'm currently sat in. Admittedly, not all mine. My daughter and her partner and my wife and myself, my son and so on, they've all got them. Even something as simple as a tablet.
Well, Mike, thank you ever so much for joining us and taking us through some of the history of computing. It's been a pleasure having you on. Do stay on in the background in case anybody has some questions. They can ask you about what it was like to work on some of those large machines.
I certainly will.
It's been a pleasure talking with you. Thank you very much.
For taking part. Thank you very much for letting me do this.
Thank you. And as we were just talking about cybersecurity, I've just put a slide up. We do a lot of work with Malvern Science in the Park and Festival Innovation with the regional organised crime unit known as ROCU, and they've kindly provided some resources here that you can go and have a look at. Obviously, they are great supporters of what we're doing, but they also want to guide and encourage people into making good decisions about cybersecurity and avoiding cyber crime. So if you're interested in any of that, it's also a good career to get into the future. They've got lots of really interesting resources.